Northern Plains, late 1880s. While every homesteader raced to stack logs above ground before the first snow, one immigrant was still digging in late September, 6 feet down into a south-facing hillside. His neighbors called it a grave in the dirt. They said it would freeze solid, flood with spring melt, collapse under snow. He built walls of packed earth faced with stone. He framed a roof with logs, then buried it under 12 inches of rock and 3 feet of soil, 8,000 pounds pressing down on timber beams. He spent 2 months on a shelter others dismissed as backward and unhealthy. Then January arrived. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero for 5 straight nights. Wind chills far worse. Standard log cabins burned through 3 cords of wood that month and still saw interior temperatures fall to 10 degrees by morning. Frost formed on the inside walls. Stoves failed. Families huddled under every blanket they owned. But that stone roof dugout? It held steady at 32 degrees with one small evening fire. No drafts. No midnight refueling. Firewood use cut by 60%. What did he understand about earth, thermal mass, and survival that everyone else missed, and why did the method they mocked become the one they copied the very next season? If you respect real stories that carry lessons worth passing on, make sure to subscribe. There are more historical accounts ahead. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. The homesteader arrived on the Northern Plains in the spring of 1886, carrying tools and knowledge that set him apart before he ever broke ground. He was Scandinavian, most likely Norwegian, though some records suggest Swedish or possibly Icelandic lineage. What mattered more than his exact origin was what he brought with him: memory of turf houses built into hillsides, stone-laden roofs that required no replacement, and winters survived in regions where timber was too precious to burn carelessly. He had seen earth used not as a last resort but as a deliberate choice, and he understood that warmth in extreme cold came not from fighting the season with fire alone but from working with what the ground itself could provide. His claim sat on gently rolling prairie, treeless except for cottonwoods along the creek bottom. Most settlers immediately felled what timber they could find and began stacking logs into rectangular cabins, each one elevated on stone footings to keep floors above the snow line and allow air to circulate beneath. The standard approach called for walls 8 to 10 inches thick, chinked with mud and prairie grass, with a stone or clay chimney built against one exterior wall. Roofs were either sod laid over thin poles or split shakes if enough timber could be spared. These cabins went up in 3 to 4 weeks if a man worked steadily, and neighbors helped each other raise walls and set ridgepoles in a tradition that doubled as social necessity. The immigrant did not follow this pattern. In mid-July, while others were finishing their cabins and turning attention to breaking sod for next season's crops, he began surveying the low hills that rose in modest waves across his southern boundary. He walked the slopes in early morning and late afternoon, watching how shadows fell and where runoff pooled after summer storms. By early August, he had chosen a site, a south-facing hillside with a gentle grade, protected from north wind by the rise behind it and positioned to catch low winter sun. He marked the spot with stakes and began digging. Neighbors noticed immediately. They came by on horseback or stopped their wagons to watch him work, and their questions carried skepticism that soon hardened into ridicule. Why dig into the earth when you could build above it? Why spend weeks excavating when logs were waiting to be stacked? One man, a veteran of 5 Plains winters, told him flatly that underground shelters flooded in spring, froze solid in winter, and collapsed under snow. Another called it a grave. A third said it looked like something Indians would build, and he did not mean it as a compliment. The immigrant listened without argument, offered no defense, and kept digging. By late September, the excavation was complete, a chamber roughly 12 feet wide and 18 feet deep, cut 6 to 8 feet into the hillside. The back wall was raw earth, faced with flat stones set without mortar. The side walls were timber cribbing, hewn logs stacked horizontally and notched at the corners, forming a frame that held back soil while allowing the earth itself to remain the primary barrier. The front wall was the only fully constructed element, built with heavier logs and pierced by a single low door, barely 5 feet high and less than 3 feet wide. Above this opening, he framed a roof using the straightest cottonwood logs he could find, each one stripped of bark and set parallel across the span. Over these he laid smaller poles crosswise, then a tight layer of willow branches and prairie grass. Then came stone, flat slabs of limestone carried up from the creek bed, 12 to 18 inches of it, covering the entire roof. Finally, he shoveled soil over the stone, packing it down until the roof carried 2 to 3 feet of earth, dense and heavy, a load estimated at 8,000 to 12,000 pounds pressing steadily on the timber frame below. The first snow fell in mid-October. His neighbors were inside their cabins, fires already burning daily, confident they had built correctly. The immigrant hung a wool blanket over his narrow door, stacked split wood against the exterior wall where it would stay dry under the roof's overhang, and settled in to wait for winter. What the immigrant understood, and what his neighbors did not, was that earth below a certain depth stops responding to the air above it. Soil temperature at 4 to 6 feet down remains near the annual average temperature of the region, typically 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit across much of the northern plains. This stability exists because soil conducts heat slowly. It absorbs warmth in summer and releases it in winter, but the exchange happens over months, not hours. By the time surface temperatures plunge to 30 below zero, the ground 6 feet down is still holding the memory of September. This principle was not the immigrants' invention. Plains native tribes had built earth lodges for generations, structures partially sunk into the ground with heavy sod roofs and timber frames that required far less fuel than any European design. Army officers stationed at frontier posts noted in their journals that these lodges remained livable during blizzards that left soldier barracks unbearable. Scandinavian turf houses operated on identical logic, dug into hillsides across Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, their roofs so thick with sod that grass and wildflowers grew on them in summer. The physics were universal. The immigrant had simply carried that knowledge across an ocean and applied it where no one else thought to look. The design depended on thermal mass, not insulation. Insulation resists heat transfer. Thermal mass absorbs and stores it. The stone and earth covering the roof weighed thousands of pounds, and that weight was not decorative. Stone holds temperature. It warms slowly when exposed to heat and cools slowly when heat is removed. The soil packed above it did the same. Together, they created a buffer that smoothed out the wild swings of plains weather. A fire lit in the evening would warm the interior air, and that warmth would move into the stone and earth, which would hold it and release it gradually through the night. By morning, even with the fire out, the interior temperature would have dropped only a few degrees. The excavation itself provided additional advantage. By cutting into the hillside rather than building on top of it, the immigrant placed 3 of his 4 walls in direct contact with stable earth. The back wall and both side walls were soil, faced with stone or timber but backed by the ground's own mass. Only the front wall faced the weather directly, and even that was protected by the roof's overhang and the low, narrow door that minimized air exchange. Cold air is dense and sinks. By keeping the entrance low, he ensured that any cold air entering the shelter would settle near the floor, while warmer air remained at head height where people lived and worked. He had also cut a drainage trench upslope from the shelter, 12 to 18 inches wide and lined with gravel, angled to carry snowmelt and rain away from the roof and walls. This was not an afterthought. Water was the enemy of any underground structure. If moisture accumulated against the walls or pooled on the roof, it would seep through, destabilize the soil, and turn the interior into a cold, damp trap. The trench intercepted runoff before it reached the shelter, channeling it downhill and away. Inside, the floor was packed clay mixed with ash and covered with a thin layer of straw, a surface that stayed dry and provided slight insulation from the ground below. By late November, word had spread through the scattered homesteads that a hard winter was coming. Old-timers read the signs: early snow, thick fur on rabbits, restless behavior in cattle. The immigrant heard the talk and checked his woodpile. He had cut and split enough to see him through, but not the massive quantities his neighbors were stacking. He trusted the ground more than the fire. 36357. The cold front arrived in early January of 1887. It came from the northwest, dropping temperatures across the northern plains to levels that broke previous records and killed livestock by the hundreds. Weather observers in scattered settlements recorded readings of 25 to 35 degrees below zero for 5 consecutive nights, with daytime highs barely climbing above zero. Wind accompanied the cold, steady and relentless, driving the chill factor far lower than the thermometer could show. Snow that had fallen in December was picked up and redeposited in drifts that buried fence lines and piled against cabin walls, sealing windows and doors under tons of frozen weight. In the above-ground cabins, the crisis was immediate. Families woke to find frost coating the interior walls, ice forming in water buckets kept beside the stove, and children shivering under piles of blankets despite fires that had burned all night. The standard response was to burn more wood. Men hauled split logs from outdoor piles, feeding stoves every 2 to 3 hours, trying to hold interior temperatures above 15 degrees. Chimneys, choked with creosote from constant use, began to smoke back into living spaces. Gaps in the chinking, invisible in moderate weather, became channels for wind that no amount of stuffing could fully block. One family's stove cracked from thermal stress. Another ran through their entire January woodpile in the first 10 days and began burning furniture. The skeptical neighbor, the man who had called the immigrants' shelter a grave, found himself burning 2 to 3 cords of wood that month compared to his usual single cord. His cabin, which had seemed solid through 4 previous winters, now felt like a box balanced on stilts, exposed to every gust. He kept the fire roaring, but by morning the interior temperature would drop to 10 or 12 degrees, cold enough that his children refused to leave their beds until the stove was relit and the air warmed. He split more wood. He stuffed more grass into the chinking. He cursed the season and wondered how much longer his supply would last. Inside the stone-roof dugout, the immigrant lit a small fire each evening, enough to warm a pot of stew and raise the interior temperature to perhaps 35 or 38 degrees. Then he let it die. The stone and earth above absorbed that warmth and held it through the night. By morning, the interior had cooled to 32 or 33 degrees, just at the freezing point, but no lower. There were no drafts. The low door and thick walls kept the wind entirely outside. Water stored in clay vessels buried in niches along the earthen wall did not freeze. The immigrant slept through the night without waking to stoke a fire, rising at dawn to rekindle coals that still held faint heat from the evening before. His firewood consumption for the month was 1.5 cords, roughly half what his neighbors were burning, and he was warmer. The difference was measurable. It was not a matter of opinion or toughness. The shelter worked because it did not rely on continuous combustion to fight the cold. It worked because the earth itself, stable and indifferent to the chaos above, provided a thermal foundation that required only modest supplemental heat to remain livable. Livestock losses mounted across the region. Cattle froze in open pastures. Horses, packed into makeshift shelters, still suffered frostbite on their ears and legs. The cold persisted through mid-January, then finally broke. When the wind calmed and temperatures climbed back to 0, then 10 above, then 20, the surviving homesteaders emerged to assess the damage. Cabins stood, but many showed cracks in the logs, warped door frames, and chimneys that would need repair before next season. The immigrants' shelter showed no damage at all. The skeptical neighbor arrived at the immigrants' shelter on the afternoon of January 18, embarrassed but out of options. His stove had cracked 2 days earlier, a long vertical split in the firebox that let smoke pour into the cabin faster than it vented through the chimney. His wife and 3 children were huddled under blankets in a structure that now measured 8 degrees inside with no safe way to add heat. He had tried patching the stove with clay, but the patch crumbled as soon as the metal expanded. He needed refuge, and the only warm place within walking distance was the dugout he had mocked 4 months earlier. The immigrant opened the low door without comment. The neighbor had to stoop to enter, and once inside he stood blinking in the dim light that filtered through a single small window cut into the front wall. The interior was perhaps 12 by 18 feet, smaller than his own cabin, but the air was still. There were no drafts. A simple alcohol thermometer hung from a timber beam, its column of red liquid resting just above freezing. The floor was dry packed clay covered with straw. A small fire burned in a central hearth, little more than a ring of stones with a clay chimney rising through the roof. The neighbor realized immediately that this fire was half the size of what he had been burning, yet the space felt warmer than his own cabin had in days. By evening, another family arrived. Their woodpile had run out entirely, and they had been burning fence posts and tool handles to keep from freezing. The immigrant made space. The shelter now held 7 people in addition to himself, crowded but manageable. What happened next demonstrated another principle the immigrant had understood from the beginning: human bodies generate heat. 7 adults and children, each producing roughly 80 to 100 watts of thermal energy simply by existing, raised the interior temperature by 3 to 5 degrees without any increase in fire size. The stone and earth absorbed this additional warmth and held it. By morning, with the fire reduced to coals, the interior measured 35 degrees, warmer than it had been when only the immigrant occupied the space. The comparison was undeniable now. The skeptical neighbor had burned 3 cords of wood in 3 weeks and still nearly lost his family to the cold. The immigrant had burned less than half a cord in the same period and maintained a space that could shelter multiple families without strain. The stone roof, which neighbors had predicted would collapse, had not shifted. The walls, which they said would freeze solid, remained dry and stable. The low door, which looked like an inconvenience, had proven to be a critical design element that kept warm air from escaping and cold air from flooding the interior. The immigrant did not lecture. He explained the method plainly, step by step, in the same practical tone he might use to describe how to split wood or repair a wagon wheel. He walked them through the excavation depth, the drainage trench, the roof construction, the positioning relative to the sun and wind. He explained thermal mass and soil temperature, not as abstract concepts but as observable facts that anyone could test. The stone absorbed heat and released it slowly. The earth stayed near 50 degrees 6 feet down, regardless of what the air above did. A small fire in a well-designed space accomplished more than a large fire in a poorly designed one. The skeptical neighbor listened differently now. He asked questions about measurements, materials, and timing. He wanted to know how deep to dig, how thick the roof should be, how to calculate the load-bearing capacity of the frame. The immigrant answered each question with specifics. 6 to 8 feet of excavation. 12 to 18 inches of stone. 2 to 3 feet of packed earth. Timber beams at least 8 inches in diameter, set no more than 2 feet apart. These were not guesses. They were dimensions proven by use. Spring came late in 1887, and when the snow finally melted, homesteaders across the region emerged to inspect what the winter had done to their structures. The above-ground cabins showed predictable damage. Logs had cracked along their length from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Door frames had warped, leaving gaps that would need to be planed and refitted. Chimneys built against exterior walls had shifted where frost had heaved their foundations, creating dangerous gaps where sparks could escape into wall cavities. Roofs sagged under the weight of accumulated ice. Several families faced complete rebuilding before the next winter arrived. The immigrant's stone-roof dugout stood exactly as it had in September. The timber frame had not shifted. The stone and earth covering showed no cracks or settling. The drainage trench had done its work, carrying snowmelt away from the structure without allowing moisture to penetrate the walls. Inside, the air was cool but dry, the packed clay floor unchanged, the earthen walls firm and stable. The structure had required no maintenance, no repair, and no adjustment. It had simply performed as designed. By June, 3 neighboring families had begun their own excavations. They followed the immigrants' dimensions closely, not as an experiment but as a survival decision. They dug 6 to 8 feet into south-facing slopes, framed roofs with cottonwood logs spaced 2 feet apart, and covered them with stone and soil in the proportions the immigrant had specified. They cut drainage trenches upslope and kept the front doors low and narrow. One family added a second room by extending the excavation deeper into the hillside, creating a sleeping chamber separated from the main living space by a log partition. Another built a small root cellar into the back wall, taking advantage of the stable temperature to store potatoes and carrots through the following winter without freezing or spoilage. The adopting family, the one that had run out of firewood and taken refuge in the immigrants' shelter during the coldest nights, rebuilt entirely. They abandoned their above-ground cabin and moved into a hillside dugout completed by late summer. That winter, they burned 1 cord of wood per month compared to the 3 cords they had consumed the previous year. Their children slept through the night without waking to cold. The parents no longer rose at midnight to stoke the fire. The structure required so little maintenance that they spent their time on other work, cutting fence posts and breaking new ground instead of splitting endless cords of firewood. An agricultural observer passing through the region in 1889 noted the shift in construction methods in a report filed with the Territorial Land Office. He recorded interior temperatures, fuel consumption rates, and structural durability across multiple homesteads, documenting what the immigrant had proven through practice. His measurements showed that earth-sheltered dwellings maintained interior temperatures within a 5-degree range over 24-hour periods, while above-ground cabins fluctuated by 20 to 30 degrees. He noted the reduced firewood requirements, the absence of frost damage, and the long-term stability of properly constructed dugouts. These observations, dry and bureaucratic in tone, quietly validated what neighbors had learned through desperation. By the mid-1890s, agricultural extension bulletins published by land-grant colleges and territorial offices began endorsing earth-sheltered designs for plains homesteaders. The recommendations were cautious and hedged with warnings about proper drainage and site selection, but the core advice was clear: digging into the earth and covering structures with stone and soil reduced fuel consumption, increased thermal stability, and extended structural lifespan. The technique the immigrant had carried from Scandinavia, and that plains tribes had practiced for generations, was now official policy. The immigrant himself continued to live in his stone-roof dugout for another 2 decades. He never built a conventional cabin. He never needed to. The shelter worked because it did not fight winter with flame alone. It worked because it let Earth do what Earth always does: stay steady. Preparation that looked excessive in fair weather turned out to be exact when conditions turned deadly.